In my introductory remarks this morning, which some of you, I think, were not here for, I indicated that this is the International Year of Youth, designated by the United Nations. And in so designating it, they had taken 3 letters as their key letters for the program for youth, and they were peace, development, and participation. And our first speaker this morning, Mr. Jack Matthews, directed his comments really on educating for international understanding, which I'm sure he's convinced, as we are, will assist in leading this world to peace and tranquility. Our second speaker this morning is Dr. Glen Eyford, whom I've had the privilege of serving with on our National Spiritual Assembly for longer than probably he or I would like to remind ourselves of. Glen is presently, the director of the MA Community. I'm sorry, he isn't. He was the director of the MA Community Development Program at the University of Alberta, and he worked on developing that program for a period of 10 years. He has now shifted his venue of work to the Center for International Education and Development at the same university, the University of Alberta, which is in Edmonton, Alberta. And Glen has also traveled considerably around the world. He has pioneered to Iceland. He has spent some time in India. And of course, as a member of our National Spiritual Assembly, he has traveled extensively throughout North America and to Israel as well. The topic of Glen's talk this morning is education for development. And I was talking to my colleague on the organizing committee, and both he and I don't really know how youth got dropped out of the title of these talks. It didn't seem to matter in terms of presentation by Jack Matthews, because that's where he was at. And it's our hope that Dr. Eyford is also educating for development with a focus on youth. Glen?
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. When you think of the topic education for development, it doesn't sound all that exciting. So maybe we have to think of some other ways of expressing it. Education for change. Everybody is concerned about change, about the pace of change. A lot of us think that there are many things in the world today that need to be changed quickly, radically, and maybe desperately. And some of the more fanatic people amongst us know exactly how change should come about. I'd like to start off by kind of developing a continuum, a scale of how change can be effected. And I'm going to involve you as much as I can in this continuum. And you can think of change as something you would bring about in a child or in a society. But I'd like to start focusing our attention on the social aspects of change. How change in the past, historically, traditionally, has been wrought in societies. And if it were your job to bring about change in a society, in a community, what would be the quickest way to bring about change? Pardon? Well, that's a pretty long process. It's one way of doing it, but I want really quick results. I want change next week. Yeah. No, that's too long. I want another kind of dictator. I want change immediately. How do you do it? Pardon? Fire? Well, you force it. You have a revolution. If you want change, you force that change through direct conflict. Some group feels it has the truth or has the power, and they take over the running of that country. And that is very effective change. It's not necessarily good change. It's not necessarily long-lasting. Why isn't it long-lasting? That's right. The revolution can be reversed in the next 6 months. Just watch the history of Bolivia for the last 20 or 30 years. I was in Bolivia a while ago, and some friends of mine were taking me past the presidential palace, and they were saying, we don't call that the presidential palace, that's the presidential hotel, because they just keep changing occupants about every 6 months. Revolution, force, violence is a tried, I was going to say true, it is a tried method of bringing about change. Most of us rebel against that. We wouldn't want change any more than we want our life to be changed by force, saying that you must do this or else you'll be beaten or put in prison. Unfortunately, there's a lot of that kind of change still occurring in the world. Okay, let's give up that as an option. Wouldn't it be nice if the world could give that up as an option? What's the next worst way of bringing about change? Okay, changing laws. Or as what we are very good at in North America, it's legislation and planning. We plan change. Most of our government offices are filled with people who are specialists in planning and programming and legislation, and it can change the laws in terms of discrimination, in terms of minorities and so on. But again, it's a bit long in terms of taking its effect. But it's what we seem to do best in North America. Planning, programming, bringing about change by legislation, by creating new institutions. The trouble with that is it makes us very reliant on the expert. Most city governments have planners. Most provincial and state governments have planners and organizers. And it assumes that they have some hold on the truth, which is for our good. Most planning does not take place with much reference to the people for whom that plan is intended. We put these people in position because we trust them. And maybe they plan well and maybe they don't. And we think of many of the centralized government operations throughout the world, Cuba and Russia. Planning is a big activity. They know what the objectives are, and their challenge is to plan those changes. And sometimes they can bring about a better crop, bring about better production, but equally often they forget to take into account the very troublesome human factor. Okay, moving up the continuum to better ways of change. Let's say that we are impatient, or we don't want violent change, that planning is too bureaucratic. What's the next best way now to bring about change? Yeah. You're right. You're skipping one. There's one in the middle. I want to come to that one next. You've already identified the fourth one. There's one in the middle. That's education, the fourth one. There's one in the middle of this 5-point scale that has been effective in certain parts of the world. Well, rather than have too much guessing, it's public participation, where you throw open the change process to the people. Well, that would be part of it. It's where you involve the people in the change process. It's called development, sometimes called community development, sometimes called public participation. The problem with it is that the people in power do not like to share the decisions with the public. It's very time-consuming. We had a very good example of that in Edmonton when the city came up with a new housing plan for the whole city. They brought in the best planners they could find, architects, engineers, builders, resource management people, And they came up with a plan for housing styles in Edmonton for the next 25 years. And then they decided to consult with the public. Not to find out if the public liked it, but to see if the public understood it. The public was very resentful at being included at that stage. They wanted to know at the beginning what they wanted. They wanted to have their input at that stage. So the third method of bringing about significant change in a country, in a family, in an individual, as a teacher, is to involve them in the learning, changing process. And this is something which is very common in the literature, but there are very few examples of this in the Western world, where you use this participatory involvement of the citizen in determining the kind of change which is to come about. But if it does work, it works very effectively because you are committed. It's something you have been creatively involved in. So as you can see, as we work up the continuum, it's getting better and better, but we can find fewer and fewer examples. Lots of examples of the first, conflict, lots of examples of planning, mass planning. India is just a graveyard of planning that's all gone haywire. The best planners in the world have been planning, but try and plan for almost 1 billion people in 16 different states and languages and cultures and customs. And you see some of the dilemma. Okay, moving along to the fourth kind of change, we begin to talk about education, information. Great stuff. What's the matter with it? Well, quite often it is. But let's say that it isn't too much from the top. Let's say that it is meeting the needs of the interests of the people. What's the difficulty with education for change? It's long term. People are slow to learn. Unless you happen to catch something which is very timely and very much to their interest. Unless you catch them at the teachable moment. And what is the teachable moment? There are examples in Canada of some very good educational campaigns that have changed the lifestyle of a significant number of people. Can you think of any? Well, you'd like to think so. The one that's on television all the time. Participation. Now, participation has been effective, not in itself, but because it's been supported by many other support movements. The nutrition movement, the holistic health movement. And when you look at participation, you begin to have that reinforced by many things around you in magazines, in articles, aerobics, all that kind of thing. And any message to be effective in education or in propaganda or in education has to be repeated and repeated so that redundancy helps its effectiveness. So education, propaganda, information can work, provided we have the time to do it. However, when the world is falling apart and when there is a crisis, you need something which is going to work far more rapidly. And though we continue to have faith in education and information, we wonder if it's going to be mobilized quickly enough and rapidly enough to bring about that critical mass where sufficient people will have these new insights and these new ideas to begin to change. That's education for change. Education for development. Let's take an example, say smoking or diet. If people were persuaded by the truth alone, there's no problem. People know that certain things are bad for them, and you would say, well, we are rational beings, somebody said once, and therefore if we are exposed to the reasonable solution, we will change accordingly. It doesn't always work that way. We need many other ways of involving people in their own change. And the missing element always in education seems to be the involvement of the learner in the learning. So much of our education is one way. Now we move to the fifth way of change, which I think is the untried way. Or it's the way that's always worked in the past, and we now are coming back to that realization. As you go up this continuum, you'll find that each strategy of change, if you can call them that, whether it's planning or whether it's force or whether it's development, community development, become more profound, more far-reaching in the life of society. And the kind of change that has always been most far-reaching, most profound, and most long-lasting is at the end of the scale, and the one, I think, around which the future of the world revolves. And anybody want to hazard a guess as to what that kind of change could be called, what that strategy is? Yes. Well, I would call that the middle one. I would call that participatory. But let's get back to that. I think there's something to that. Yes. Okay. William? Okay, well, fine. Nothing like a prophet to come in and zap us from time to time and say, here's what you should be doing. However, these prophets do come periodically, and we say, ho-hum, what else is new? We're not quite ready for what they have to say. But the fifth strategy of change, if we look at it, people often get uncomfortable with the word spiritual. So let's change it for the sociologists amongst us, because they get very upset when you start talking about spiritual things and intangible things. Let's call it culture. And they say, oh, I know what you mean. Cultural change which is based in the value system and the belief system and the well springs of human motivation. If you look over the history of mankind, the most far-reaching and profound changes or educational programs have been rooted, as Toynbee pointed out a long time ago, in the spiritual view which has come to a civilization, around which everything else revolves. Now it would seem that the world is very much in need of some kind of focus of its future, some kind of awareness of our total capacity as a race. And for years we have neglected or ignored the spiritual, the cultural, the intangible, the metaphysical, or, I hate to introduce this term, but it sums up an awful lot. We have ignored the right brain. The right brain. We have ignored the intuitive. We have ignored the feminine. We have ignored the balance of the yin and the yang. And so much of what is coming to us in education now has said that we now have to combine both hemispheres of the brain. The right hemisphere, which is the intuitive, that which synthesizes, that which is poetic and creative, along with the left, which is analytical, quantitative, mathematical, logical, and rational. And this division of our human nature is an old division. It's as old as we've been able to recognize. But it suggests that the root of change is best placed in the so-called right brain, in the spiritual, the mystical, the metaphysical, the poetic. Now try that on your school board and see how far you get. Try, as chairman of your board, to say, if you believe this, look, folks, what we need in our school is a lot more metaphysics. We need a little bit of mysticism. How about some yoga? How about some relaxation techniques? How about some lateral thinking, folks? And they will say, no. How about the 3 basics or the 4 basics? And by all means, let's have computers. We've got to have computers. God bless the computer. We've just gone haywire over this device to further quantify and fragment our learning ability. It's a wonderful device, but I've had some very sad experiences in my own life and with my own students and with research projects that must always be identified as something which can be quantified. And many of the most interesting and exotic and exciting things in life cannot be quantified. And in a good graduate school of education, unless you can quantify it, it just isn't real. But and this is just a little pet beef of mine. I won't go too much into that. But if you look at these strategies of change, I'd like to suggest that the way in which change can occur most significantly, most long-lastingly, and most humanely and humanly is by recognizing our essential nature, which we can call spiritual, which we can call cultural, which is based in our values and our views of ourselves. And education which does not deal with that, I think, is deficient. One of the most interesting books written in education in the last few years is the 6th report to the Club of Rome. Anybody familiar with it? It's called No Limits to Learning. The first book that the Club of Rome had written for it was called Limits to Growth, in which they showed what we were doing to ourselves in the environment, with our water, with our ecology, with the forest, and so on. And they said that if we continue along this way, we are going to exhaust all these resources. And then they had some other books written. The most recent one is called No Limits to Learning. And it is a book on education. How we can turn around the present world problematique, as they call it. They use that term to describe a congeries, a connection, a knot of human problems that are almost beyond comprehension. The only way we can begin to tease out these knots is by some understanding, is by some education. And the education that they advocate is an education which we would call cultural, or which people of a religious orientation would call spiritual, which deals with the release of what they call the human spirit, which has been oppressed and suppressed by so much left-brain, quantitative, rational scientism that we need now to balance it, not to eliminate that, but to balance it with the other side of our being, which is that which cries out for creativity, for response, or in the Baha'i terminology, it releases the soul. And the soul is that part of us which first recognizes God, whatever that means. It's something which troubles us throughout our life unless it is fed or nourished through some kind of spiritual, religious, or metaphysical experience. So education for development. And let me talk now about a case in point. One of my favorite examples, and Ed and I have both been to this part of the world, in Ecuador, where there exists a Baha'i radio station, which serves a population of about 100,000 villagers, all of whom are illiterate, living on a subsistence basis of farming, haven't changed many of their ways for hundreds of years because nobody showed them anything better or newer. And so the Baha'is decided that they would serve this population by a fairly low-power radio station that would speak to these people according to their needs and interests. Well, what do you say to 100,000 people who have a tough time just staying alive, live in precarious, literally precarious conditions, don't eat too well, have many illnesses and afflictions, alcohol is a problem, family violence is a problem. So you put a radio station up there. What do you put over the radio station? You're the director of the radio station.
Interview the people in the group.
Okay, that's one thing they've done. Anybody going to listen to it? If they know the people, they'll listen to it, yes. Okay, but let's be careful. We're getting a lot of talk on this radio station. That's what they want. They don't want reminders of how miserable they are, how sick they are, how bad their kids are. They want, like all of us want, a little bit of fun. They want to be reminded that they're not too bad after all. So the radio station there, almost by accident, decided, through consultation with the people. As a teacher, you would say, well, here, I've got 9 hours. Boy, I can give them talks on nutrition, talks on how to feed your cattle, talks on fertilizer for your potatoes, a lecture here to the father, how to treat the wife and the mother, and how the mother should do this. Wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Obviously, the problem is nobody is going to listen to the radio station. So they started by playing on that radio station indigenous music, music which the people make in the villages. Every village has its own band, so to speak, and they love their music. And so the radio station with a mobile van began recording in the village all these various traditional songs, and then they played them. Well, they caught them right there. In that area, there are 12 radio stations. If you had a radio in one of these villages, you could pick up 12 radio stations, amongst which is the most powerful radio station in the entire world, HJCB. Anybody know what that stands for? Holiness Jesus Christ Broadcasting. Run and subsidized by an American group of a fundamentalist religious persuasion. Very effective, very well done, very powerful. I can pick the radio station up in Edmonton on my short wave. I can't pick Radio Baha'i up, but I can pick up this one. It's got good music. Much of it Spanish, much of it Mexican, with a fairly strong evangelical message that goes with the radio station. The radio station of choice, and we couldn't believe this until we checked it out very, very carefully, was Radio Baha'i. Not because we had a better signal or because we had jazzier music. It's because we spoke to the people about what they knew. We gave them their music, and they knew all these villages. And then we began interviewing local characters until we began to identify two people. One was called Grandfather Speaks, the other one was called Grandmother Speaks. And these were cranky, lovable people who would lecture the people about what they were doing wrong. Some of you in Canada may remember a program called Farm Radio Forum, upon which this was based. Farm Radio Forum was an involved way of getting people to understand new practices on the prairies in terms of farming. And it was done in a dramatic way by involving the people, by having them feed back ideas to the radio station. But one of the episodes was always called, in the West it was called The Jacksons. And in Ontario it was called somebody else. But the Jacksons were a typical farm family, and there was a 10-minute little soap opera about whether or not they should buy a new combine or whether or not they should do this. Real problems, but they dramatized it. And it went from sequence to sequence. And the people were hooked on that program because it was just like Dallas, only it had more, a little more redeeming social value than Dallas had. And the people learned through that. Well, they've done this now with Radio Baha'i. Radio Baha'i has become so popular that the Ministry of Agriculture has asked for an hour a week, and they've been given that hour a week, and they've provided the writer to do the program. UNICEF now uses that program, radio station, not only in Ecuador, but also now there's a radio station in Peru and in Bolivia. UNICEF uses it to speak primarily to mothers about child nutrition and child care. However, the radio station is very careful not to put too much talk. There has to be that music. Now, it isn't just music. What music is spirit, is culture. It's their past. It's what means so much to them. And along with the music, they tell stories about the old characters, the old mythology, the old folk tales, so that through this, the people are being motivated, not necessarily directly to go out and grow a better crop, but initially to begin to feel prouder about themselves, about their culture. And the broadcast is in Quechua, which is the native language, and in Spanish, so that they are spoken to in languages they can understand. The most popular announcer on the radio station, and Ed and I met her, was Maria. She's illiterate. Can you imagine an illiterate announcer? She has a memory that is the equal of no one. She's just very good. They tell her what to say, and she just goes on. They trust her. She won't say things that she doesn't believe in, and she is the main Quechua announcer, and they've developed several others since. Now, the radio station considers that it is doing education and development through music, through myth, through story. And what is this appealing to? This is not always logical. This is not social planning. This is helping people get in touch with their past, with their traditions, with their roots, so that they will discover that they are not necessarily to be oppressed and forgotten and neglected, but that they have something worth keeping. And they're reminded of this through being reminded of the glories of their past and their culture. Now, in each of the villages, this is where the education comes in, they have somebody who organizes what they call them tuning groups when they tune into the radio station. And they listen to the radio station and they discuss it. And the job of that person, usually a woman, is to help them implement whatever they've learned the next day. Let's say there's been a lesson on a better water supply for children. Instead of just listening to it and saying that's a great idea, they will then plan the next day to see if they can bring about a better water delivery system or more rigorously boil the water or whatever the message is. And again, this is patterned on good old farm radio forum, which all over the world is known about Canada. Canadians don't even remember farm